The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as the lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm glow. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation as the lights dimmed slightly, casting a warm glow on the stage where the panelists sat. Among them, the tension was almost palpable. Then, with a smirk that seemed to stretch just a little too wide, a voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Some people just read headlines," she said, her tone dripping with a kind of smug amusement. "Some of us read history books." The words hung in the air like smoke, calculated, condescending, and loud enough to draw a scattered round of laughter from her supporters in the front rows. She didn't look in Karoline's direction at first. That was the strategy: dismiss her without the dignity of direct acknowledgement. The comment was meant to undercut, to belittle, to plant a seed of doubt in the minds of the audience about who belonged on that stage and who didn't. It wasn't just a jab at education. It was a veiled shot at credibility, intelligence, and background. A public attempt to draw a line between the so-called elite and the people who had fought their way up without institutional prestige behind them. The smattering of applause that followed wasn't overwhelming, but it was just enough to give the moment weight. The senator leaned back in her seat, visibly pleased with herself, satisfied with the reaction. She probably thought the debate was tipping in her favor, that the younger woman seated just a few feet away would shrink under. The weight of her words flustered, maybe even embarrassed. That's how these things usually played out. A carefully crafted insult, veiled in wit, drawing laughter and subtle nods of approval from those who already agreed with her. It was the old playbook of politics, one she had mastered. But what she didn't account for was the silence that followed. Not just the few seconds after her quip, but the longer, heavier pause as people in the audience turned their eyes not to her, but to the other side of the stage. There was a different kind of energy forming now, quiet and electric. It wasn't the kind that comes from applause. It was the kind that comes from realization, people beginning to sense that something unexpected was about to happen, that this wasn't going to be one of those nights where the underdog folds. Karoline didn't respond right away. She sat, still, hands folded in front of her, letting the moment breathe. She didn't rush to interrupt or fire back with a clever one-liner. That restraint in itself said something. It showed poise. It showed that she wasn't shaken. If anything, it showed that she was building something in her mind. An answer, not a reaction. Her eyes scanned the room, not in panic, but in purpose. She wasn't looking for approval. She was assessing the atmosphere, recognizing the opportunity that had just fallen into her lap. The senator, still smiling, likely assumed she had scored a win. But the room had shifted. There was no laughter now, just the quiet rustle of expectation. And that silence said more than any reaction ever could. It said the crowd wasn't entirely comfortable with what had just been said, that maybe the jab hadn't landed the way it was intended, that maybe it had exposed more about the one who said it than the one it was aimed at. Moments like these reveal the subtle cracks in polished personas. Because when someone resorts to mocking education, especially in a room full of voters from all walks of life, it becomes clear who sees themselves above the rest. The attempt to paint someone as inferior based on the name of a college or lack of one isn't just petty, it's elitist, and people can sense that. They may laugh in the moment, but they remember the tone. They remember the arrogance. They remember who decided to punch down. What the senator may have forgotten in that moment is that credentials don't always equal connection. Degrees don't guarantee wisdom. And a polished resume doesn't automatically earn trust. Especially not in a climate where people are tired of being talked down to, tired of being made to feel like their lived experiences count for less than a bullet point on someone else's CV. It's one thing to bring facts to a debate. It's another to wield education like a weapon, with the goal of humiliating someone who doesn't fit your mold. That's not strength. That's insecurity disguised as sophistication. And so the audience waited. Not for another joke, not for another applause line, but for the person they almost wrote off to respond. The silence deepened. The moment, now undeniably pivotal, hung in the air like a charged wire. It was clear something had shifted. Not on the stage, but in the hearts and minds of the people watching. She didn't rush. She didn't rise out of her chair like someone who had just been insulted in front of a live audience. There was no flash of panic across her face, no frantic reaching for words. Instead, she let the moment breathe. The sting of the comment still lingered in the air, the smug little jab about education, a dig that was meant to draw lines between us and them. But she didn't take the bait. She sat there quietly, her posture steady, her hands calmly folded in her lap. And when she finally looked up, there was something in her expression that made the room lean in just a little closer. It wasn't anger. That would have been expected. It wasn't sarcasm either. That would have played into their game. What she brought instead was composure. Not the kind that's coached or rehearsed, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and exactly what you stand for. She didn't need to shout to get the audience's attention. The silence she kept was powerful enough. And then, with a voice firm but measured, she spoke. Not to defend herself, but to reframe the entire conversation. I may not have gone to the same schools, she began, her eyes scanning the audience, but I've never needed a diploma to tell me what's right and what's wrong. That line hit with more force than anything said before it. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a redirection. She wasn't going to play on their field. She was going to build her own. The crowd started to shift in their seats, not in discomfort, but in attention. People sat up a little straighter, phones lowered, arms unfolded. She had them. Not because she was being flashy, but because she was being real. There was something refreshing about her tone, something unfiltered and unapologetically grounded. It was the voice of someone who knew what it meant to work hard, to rise without a shortcut, and to speak not from notes, but from experience. She continued, never raising her voice, yet somehow growing stronger with each sentence. Some people think education is a title you hang on your wall. I see it differently. I see it in the factory worker who trains the new guy without asking for recognition. I see it in the mom who balances 3 jobs and still shows up to her kids' school meeting. I see it in the farmer who understands more about economics than half the think tanks in DC. That line landed like a thunderclap, and still she wasn't done. What she was doing masterfully was dismantling the very premise that had been used to undermine her. She wasn't denying the value of education, far from it. She was expanding the definition. She was reminding everyone in that room and everyone watching that knowledge doesn't just come from books. It comes from living, from failing and rising, from learning the hard way. And suddenly the spotlight that had been used to try and expose her looked more like a mirror. Her calm confidence didn't just neutralize the earlier jab, it flipped the script entirely. She was no longer the one being scrutinized. She had become the one doing the evaluating, not with scorn, but with clarity. She wasn't angry. She wasn't offended. She was resolved. And that resolve resonated with people in a way no polished resume ever could. Then, without missing a beat, she added, there's this idea that you can only speak on issues if you've sat in a lecture hall. But the truth is, most of the people affected by these policies don't sit in those halls. They live out here in the real world, and someone needs to speak for them too. That wasn't just a statement. It was a mission. By now, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The earlier laughter and smug grins had vanished. What remained was a room hanging on every word, not because they were flashy, but because they were true. She had met arrogance with authenticity, and it was working. Because while some people debate ideas in theory, others live them every single day, and when those voices finally get a microphone, they don't waste it. Her delivery, deliberate and sincere, stripped away any illusion that she was out of place on that stage. She didn't need to wear her credentials like armor. Her life experience was enough. Her voice was enough. Her clarity was enough. She didn't need to match pedigree with pedigree. She just needed to speak. She paused for just a second, letting her last sentence linger. The crowd was already shifting, minds opening to a different rhythm than the one the previous speaker had set. That's when she leaned in, not physically, but in spirit. Her voice gained a new edge, It wasn't louder, but it rang with undeniable purpose. And then came the line that flipped the entire room. Degrees don't define you. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't rehearsed. It came out with the kind of clarity that only someone who truly believed it could summon. And when she said it, something changed. Not just in the auditorium, but in the hearts of the people listening. For many, it felt like someone had finally said what they had been thinking for years. That worth doesn't hang in a frame on a wall. That intelligence isn't reserved for those with access to ivory towers and exclusive scholarships. She took a breath and let that truth settle before continuing. Your education doesn't make you better than the trucker who's been hauling freight for 30 years. It doesn't make you more important than the nurse pulling a double shift in a trauma ward. It sure doesn't make you more insightful than the single mom trying to figure out how to afford groceries and rent in the same week. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't waver. Because she wasn't just talking to people. She was speaking for them. You could see it in the faces across the room. Some were stunned, others nodding slowly. People weren't reacting to drama. They were responding to recognition. What she was saying wasn't about ideology or political angles. It was about dignity, about reminding people that life has taught them things no classroom ever could. That character, perseverance, and instinct aren't measured by grades or titles, but by how you carry yourself when no one's clapping, when no one's grading you. She went on, not to boast or grandstand, but to widen the lens. There are people who couldn't afford college, who never had the option. Some started working straight out of high school. Others stayed home to take care of family. And some served this country in uniform instead of sitting behind a desk. Are we really going to tell them their voices matter less? It wasn't a question so much as a challenge. That's when the audience began to shift more noticeably. People leaned forward. A few clapped softly, not out of politeness, but out of resonance. She wasn't just answering an insult anymore, she was building something. A new narrative. One that didn't rely on exclusion or hierarchy, but on shared experience. And for many, it was the first time in a long while that someone on a stage like that had taken the time to speak their truth, unfiltered and without apology. She didn't stop there. When did we start believing that only a select few are qualified to lead? That leadership only comes from lectures, not from living? That the people who get their hands dirty, on farms, in warehouses, in hospitals, don't understand what this country needs? Her voice rose slightly, not with volume, but with conviction. It wasn't just a defense of her own background anymore. It was a defense of millions. She was peeling back the curtain on a game that had been played for decades, where credentials were used to silence, where lived experience was dismissed as anecdotal, and where people were told again and again that if they didn't speak a certain way or learn a certain way, their opinions didn't count. She was cutting through all of that with one idea, that wisdom doesn't come with a certificate. It comes from standing in life's fire and walking out the other side stronger. And by now, it was clear the crowd wasn't just listening. They were feeling it. That's what happens when someone puts words to the quiet frustrations people have carried for too long. She wasn't preaching, she was connecting. She was validating the idea that someone working the night shift or running a small business might actually know more about the economy than the people writing policy memos. And through it all, she stayed composed. No theatrics, no personal attacks, just truth, delivered with an authenticity that couldn't be faked. She had taken what was meant to be a slight and turned it into a declaration. She didn't need to wear prestige like armor. Her credibility came from something deeper, a lived understanding of the people others so easily overlook. She could have stopped there. She had already taken the sting out of the insult, turned the tide of the room, and reframed the entire narrative. But instead, she kept going, not to drag the moment out, but because there was something still left to say. Something that hadn't yet been spoken aloud but had been building in the silence, in the tension, in the eyes of every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. She stood firm, her voice steady, and delivered what would become the most unforgettable line of the night. You can mock my education all you want, but at least I earned mine without selling out my values. And just like that, the temperature in the room changed. It wasn't just another clever comeback, it was a truth that hit hard and hit home. The audience, silent just a heartbeat before, erupted, not in polite applause, not in nervous laughter, in thunderous raw approval. It wasn't just about her anymore. In that moment, she wasn't just defending herself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or condescended to because they didn't come from the right background or didn't speak in a polished academic cadence. What made it so powerful wasn't the sting of the line itself, but the substance behind it. The integrity, the quiet strength of someone who had walked into the room knowing she'd be targeted and still chose to stand tall, not for the cameras, not for applause, but for the principle of the thing. That line wasn't a soundbite. It was a shield. A final stand that no one on the opposing side was ready for. And what followed wasn't just applause. It was a kind of stunned recognition. Even those who had been smirking moments before now sat frozen. They weren't just witnessing a rhetorical win. They were witnessing a transformation. A moment when the one being laughed at became the one commanding the stage. Without yelling. Without theatrics. Just raw, unshakable authenticity. In the seconds that followed, the person who had delivered the original jab remained silent. And that silence said more than any rebuttal ever could. The smirk was gone. The condescension had evaporated, because once the crowd erupted, it became clear that the energy in the room had shifted permanently. There would be no reclaiming it, no resetting the stage. The moment now belonged to her. She didn't bask in the attention. She didn't smile with smug satisfaction. She simply stood, grounded, letting the truth of her words do all the work. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't about clever lines. It was about clarity. It was about calling out a culture where people are too often judged by their credentials instead of their character, where policy is made by people who think credentials are proof of morality, and where far too many voices have been silenced by the weight of elitism disguised as intellect. And that line? At least, I earned mine without selling out my values, cut to the heart of the issue. It wasn't just about schooling, it was about integrity, about the choices we make when no one's watching, about how easy it is to say the right things in front of a camera while compromising behind closed doors, and how rare it is to see someone speak without fear of losing approval because they weren't looking for it in the first place. As she finished speaking, the applause didn't die down quickly. It swelled, grew, became something more than just appreciation. It became affirmation. The crowd wasn't just clapping for a clever remark. They were clapping because someone had finally stood up and said what needed to be said, not with rage, not with disdain, but with conviction so clear it couldn't be ignored. Even the moderators, caught off guard by the sudden and unexpected shift in momentum, paused longer than usual. There was no quick move to the next question, no awkward effort to smooth things over, because everyone in the room knew something significant had just happened. A line had been crossed, not by her, but by the one who had underestimated her. And when that line was crossed, she didn't lash out, she simply held the truth up like a mirror. And when people looked into that mirror, they didn't see weakness, they saw strength, quiet, composed, and completely unshakable. The kind of strength that doesn't come from a textbook, but from knowing who you are and never ever letting someone else define it for you. As the lights in the room settled and the final echoes of applause faded, there was a stillness, a rare kind of silence that doesn't come from discomfort, but from reflection. People weren't looking at her the same way anymore. What started as a dismissive moment aimed at undermining her had transformed into something much bigger, something far more enduring. The insult had been eclipsed, not with retaliation, but with resilience. She had turned a moment of attempted ridicule into a masterclass in grace under fire. Her message resonated because it wasn't wrapped in theory or political jargon. It was rooted in experience, in authenticity, in values that don't waver with the wind. She reminded the audience of something they already knew deep down, that worth isn't measured by degrees, pedigrees, or headlines. It's measured by the way you show up, by the way you treat others, and by the courage you bring into spaces where you weren't always invited. That night didn't just belong to her. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. It belonged to the young girl watching from home, who might not have straight A's but has big dreams and a backbone of steel. It belonged to the father working 2 jobs, who may never get a round of applause but deserves one all the same. It belonged to every person who's ever sat quietly in a room where their story was overlooked, until someone like her stood up and made it heard. What she proved in just a few minutes was that credentials don't grant character. And while education is valuable, it's not the only measure of intelligence or leadership. Sometimes, the most important lessons come from living through hardship, from standing firm when it's easier to bend, from daring to speak when silence would be safer. She didn't need to win anyone over with polish or perfection. She led with something much more powerful: truth. In an era where so many performances feel scripted and souls get traded for applause, her voice cut through like fresh air. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Steady, honest, unapologetic. By the end, even those who had laughed at the beginning couldn't deny the shift. Respect wasn't demanded, it was earned. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all, that the very moment meant to diminish her only magnified everything that made her impossible to ignore. She walked off that stage not as someone who had survived a political jab, but as someone who had risen above it and taken the hearts of the audience with her. Not because she played the game better, but because she refused to play it at all. Instead, she brought the conversation back to where it belongs. Real people, real values, and the quiet power of knowing exactly who you are.